Okay. Okay, let me just start by thanking Raphael actually to make me think about this in a little bit more nuanced manner again. So I will be, let me just see, okay, here, okay. I will be focusing on perpetrator history, particularly Browning's book, Goldhagen's book, and then also, let me put away the, let me see whether I can put this on, let me see whether I can put this on. Okay, and then Paul's very good article. And I had used Browning and the Goldhagen debate as an example when I was thinking about empathy and when I was writing my book on empathy, as indicating something about the limits of empathy. And I regard empathy as being essentially involved in understanding each other as rational agents when we use the folk psychological conceptual framework, attributing beliefs and desires and trying to understand agents and as acting for reasons. And in some sense, it seems when we think about these perpetrators, these ordinary men, it's tough to understand what their reasons for acting could have been. And I suggested then that there's this kind of imaginative resistance that in some sense can't really be overcome. And we then appeal to complementary and supplementary theoretical strategies of making sense of these agents. But when I thought about theoretical strategies in this particular context, and particular pointing to situations, I in some sense only thought about these theoretical strategies as in some sense providing us with causal explanations and not explanations in terms of reasons. So when I thought about situations in this particular context, I thought about examples such as the experiments that psychologists did when they talked about, when they gave people a choice of choosing from a row of socks, and they told them all of these socks are of equal quality. And it seems that people tended to take the socks on the right side and then somehow concocted a story about why they choose the ones on the right side, confabulated. So they didn't seem to be aware of the causal factors that really determine the behavior. And it seems as if there is a right-handed bias, since we tend to be mostly right-handed, and that might explain that. And so appealing to these causal conditions seems to allow us to get some kind of understanding, but in some sense, we want an understanding in terms of reasons. And I would want to say that trying to understand in terms of reasons and therefore taking the empathic perspective-taking approach is still the default method of trying to make sense of other agents. And I think this is basically indicated and remains with us by the fundamental explanatory. Do you actually see the full slides? I think I have to put, let me just put the, okay. Okay, the questions and the explanatory problems that each of these authors had. So when we look at Browning, the problem is how to explain that ordinary individual agents participate in a gruesome mass extermination, even though they are given the choice to excuse themselves. We are asked to put ourselves in the perspective of these ordinary agents, but ultimately he seems to only appeal to theoretical strategies. In Goldhagen, you have the smile problem. Why do people smile while they do horrendous things or while they observe doing horrendous things? He explains why they do that in terms of attributing certain intentions, certain preferences to Germans, what he calls eliminationist anti-Semitism. The problem that I actually find particularly severe is how to make sense of this kind of explanation that one of the ordinary men of Police Battalion 101 gave. It's a very famous quote by that Browning made in his book. I made the effort, and it was possible for me to shoot only children. It so happened that the mothers led the children by the hand. My neighbors then shot the mother, and I shot the child that belonged to her, because I reasoned with myself that after all, without its mother, the child could not live any longer. It was supposed to be, so to speak, soothing my conscience to release children unable to live without their mothers. Now, whether or not he really thought that while engaged in the killing is a different question. He probably provided that as a justification, it seems, in terms of talking to the court, to the reporter, in order to excuse himself somehow, to get a milder sentence. The question, though, is, what kind of state of mind does he have to be in that he thinks of that as a kind of justification, or as kind of an excuse to do what he did? So it seems we kind of really can't make sense of those kind of agency. We can't bring their reasons home to ourselves. And so this is what I regarded as the limits of empathy. That is, we are asked, it seems, to make sense of the actions of perpetrators, trying to take their perspective, using our capacity of reenactive empathy, trying to grasp the reasons for acting, the space of experience, and the horizon of expectation, as Kozelek and also Kohut a term that, but we seem to encounter an irreducible form of imaginative resistance. And so we are unable to do that. And then we fall back on this kind of supplementary strategy to gain some form of explanatory understanding. What I want to say is always a second best. And because it's only a second best, and we ultimately would like to have a kind of explanation in terms of reasons, I would suggest that our understanding of the perpetrators is always a fragmentary kind of understanding. We can't fully make sense of them as rational agents in some sense. Okay, so this as a preliminary introduction. What I will do next is I will briefly talk a little bit more about my conception of empathy and explain why I regard empathy as epistemically necessary, particularly reenactive empathy, insofar as our grasping as thoughts as reasons are concerned. Then I will briefly talk about what I would regard, and here I follow Harry Frankfurt, what I regard the care structure of human agency. That is, ultimately, we need to understand what agents care about when we try to understand their reasons for acting. And here we'll say a little bit about why that on its own should make us worry about the intelligibility of the eliminationist anti-Semitism thesis of Goldhagen. I will briefly then talk about two additional modes of explanatory understanding that kind of supplement empathic understanding, which I call narrative and theoretical understanding, focusing mostly on theoretical understanding. And here then I will talk about what theoretical understanding contributes in letting us think about the normative structure of the social domain, and then talk briefly about Milgram and our nature as moralizing animals. And then I conclude. Okay, so let me briefly talk about my conception of empathy. There are different conceptions of empathy. I don't really want to get into all of the great details, just focus on my conception. I regard empathy as a kind of resonance phenomena of different cognitive complexity, distinguish between what I call basic empathy and reenactive empathy. And at the center of our understanding of each other as agents is basically the individual embodied and situated agent who in some sense is attuned to his environment and recognizes the environment in certain ways and sees and responds rational to aspects of the environment in acting. Empathy, from my perspective, concerns the whole range of mental phenomena. And in that sense, I think most people coming from the social science tradition, when they talk about empathy, think about empathy as covering the whole range of mental states that constitute our mental life, not merely affective mental states. When I talk about basic empathy, that has mostly to do with our empathic grasp of each other's emotions in the face-to-face encounter, and also our perceptual grasp of a kind of goal-directedness of our physical bodily movements. And that goes back to something that Galisi and Resolati focus on when they discovered, so to speak, the mirror neurons. So I think to a large extent that might be mediated on the neurobiological level by mirror neurons, but it basically has to do with face-to-face encounters. So we see that the other person in some sense is grasping the cup of coffee, that the hand is moving towards the cup. And we don't just interpret these bodily movements in merely physical terms, but see them as being directed towards an object in the environment. Similarly, we recognize directly in a perceptual manner the expression that a person shows or manifests by having certain facial expressions, that he's angry or she's angry, that she is surprised, etc., etc. And the way I think about that is basically that the mechanisms of basic empathy allow us to recognize directly and create a certain kind of perceptual similarity space within which we understand each other as like-minded creature, and I understand the other in some sense as being like me. And there's a certain kind of familiarity when I see the other person move in a certain way, because I directly understand that is the way, that is an action that I can also perform, that is an emotion that I also could express. And I think this in some sense allows us in an epistemically direct manner to delineate the scope, the domain of bodily movements, skillful agency that we then further interpret in terms of folk psychologies. That is, basic empathy allows us to understand that the person is grasping a cup, that the person feels a certain kind of emotion, but it doesn't necessarily understand why that is the case. So basic empathy, I don't think, allows us to gain much explanatory understanding. That is only able or possible in light of the mental terminology that we use in attributing folk psychological states. And what is important from my perspective is that in doing that, I think we are essentially dependent on our capacity to take the perspective of another person. And so insofar as we are talking about understanding historical agency, since we don't necessarily encounter these people face to face, we depend on perspective taking here. We try to understand when we attribute another person's belief desires as reasons for acting, what we have to do is, because in some sense we have to situate those beliefs and desires in the larger context of his other mental states. Belief desires on their own don't necessarily allow us to understand how they can be reasons for acting unless we make certain further assumptions about what belief and desires the other agents shares with us. And I tend to illustrate that with these two very ordinary examples. So he went to the fridge because he wanted to get a beer. Now, it seems as if we are just attributing a belief or desire to that person, and automatically we understand those belief desires attributions as reasons, as considerations that from the perspective of the agent speaks for the action. And it doesn't seem to require very much of perspective taking. And so you might want to say, maybe a theory theorist, a person who just thinks that we can understand that by utilizing a kind of implicit theory, is able to account for that. Now, what I don't think a theory theorist could account for is why the second case should create such explanatory puzzlement. That is, he went outside his yard in order to count all the leaves that had fallen onto the ground, or because he desired to count all the leaves that had fallen onto the ground. And the problem here is that if the theory theorist would be correct, then it seems we would attribute certain belief desires, and then we would have certain invariant generalizations, and that should make sense of why the person did what he did. But we can't do that, because what we are unable to do in those kind of circumstances is to understand how we could understand those kind of belief and desires, how they could constitute for us reasons for acting. What is problematic in this case is understanding how they could be my reasons for acting. This is automatically the case in the first case, but in the second case, we have to work a little bit more. We have to know a little bit more about why the person might have seen those kind of considerations as consideration that speak for his actions. And so what we normally do is we gain further knowledge about what else might be the case with that person. Maybe that person is a biologist who wants to somehow check whether the trees survived the latest moth infestation, and one way to prove that or to check that is to count all the leaves that have fallen on the ground in the fall. That kind of would make sense. So implicitly, I would want to suggest is we put ourselves in the perspective, we quarantine the beliefs that we don't, that the other agents doesn't share with us from this kind of simulation, that kind of perspective taking, and we kind of take into our cognitive system beliefs, desires on an imaginary basis that we don't share with the other agents. And in that sense, we can understand his reasons as reasons, because in taking his perspective or her perspective, we can understand how they could have been our reasons in those kind of situations. And that, I think, makes reenactive empathy as an epistemically essential aspect of making sense of other agency within the folk psychological framework. And I would want to say that similar considerations also apply to desires. That is, mere desires are only understood as reasons for acting insofar as the object of our desires appear also to be desirable from the perspective of the agent. So ultimately, we have to attribute something like a desirability characteristic to the agents. We have to integrate beliefs and desires with with other mental states that the other agents has. And so ultimately, only insofar as we can reconstruct that and bring ourselves into the perspective of the other agents, will we understand those beliefs and desires as his reasons. And I think here is a consideration that Frankfurt has about the structure of agency very relevant. That is, as he points out, rational agents are reflective agents. They have the capacity to detach themselves from the direct motivational pull of the desires and ask themselves what's from their perspective, what desires that they all have they really want to act on. What desires can we identify? And only in this context do those desires become really reasons for acting. Now, as he points out, those kind of reflections cannot go on forever. He runs into this kind of regress of first order volitions and second order volitions in order to stop that regress of higher order desires, higher order considerations. Frankfurt points out that at the very core of our agency is something that we care about, that we identify with, that in some sense is more essential part to our identity as agents than our other beliefs and desires, that may be getting a beer or counting the leaves on the ground, etc., etc. And his example is, so to speak, Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms saying, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That's an agency or a desire that seems to directly be grounded in his identity as an agent. And caring, Frankfurt said, is constituted by a complex set of cognitive, affective, volitional dispositions and states, which in some sense constitutes an agent's identity. Now, just very briefly, I mean, that in itself should give us some pause about Goldhagen's attribution of this kind of eliminationist, anti-Semitic anti-Semitism to all Germans or to agents. And the idea is that this kind of preference sometimes is hidden and not at the foreground, and the Nazi allowed it to come to the foreground. It's unclear how that should work on a psychological level, because ultimately we have to understand how those kind of preferences, desires, could be regarded to be reasons for acting. If they already were reasons for acting for Germans at all times, besides all of this historically very thin evidence that Goldhagen really has to attribute it to Germans, there is a psychological problem, I think, because ultimately we have to attribute to all Germans for all times a Nazi ideology, because it's only within this context that those kind of forms of anti-Semitism could be understood as reasons for acting. There has to be a danger that Germans supposedly recognize insofar as Jews are concerned, and that provides them with a reason for acting. To think that Germans already had those reasons for acting, but they just somehow were unaware of them, seems to be highly implausible. I think that's, from a psychological perspective, an additional argument against Goldhagen's thesis. But where I disagree a little bit with Frankfurt, I think Frankfurt doesn't sufficiently recognize that what we care about is not only up to the individual agent. What we care about tends to be socially mediated. What we care about tend to be things that our compatriots care about. We grow up caring about certain things, and we care about what other people approve of us caring about. Nothing that Frankfurt talks about recognizes the social aspect, the social constitution of human agency. I also would disagree with Frankfurt that we never can discuss or critically reflect upon what we care about, but we maybe can talk about that in the discussion. Okay, now very briefly, when we understand another person insofar as we take their perspective, we never become the other person. So understanding another person is not being another person. And as a lot of people in the empathy tradition already recognize here, just some quotes from Weber: one need not have been Caesar in order to understand Caesar. And one of my favorite quotes in this context is from Collingwood's autobiography, where he says, "So I reached my third proposition, and that is, I read my third proposition, someone have to see. Historical knowledge is the reenactment of a past thought encapsulated in the context of a present thought, which by contradicting it, confine it to a plane different from theirs. That is, we are always aware of the self and other differentiation. That is, in reenacting the other person, I'm also aware of the fact that I'm reacting the other person and that in some sense we differ from each other. Now, when you think about that agency, that at the core of agency is the structure of care, then it will become very difficult to reenact another person's agency if our care structure is very different, because it would mean that we are able to quarantine from our reenactment things that we really care about. And that's very difficult for us because that is constituted, that constitutes part of our identity. So insofar as we don't seem to care about what the perpetrators very much care about, or we don't really care about, if you think about in the contemporary context, what vaccine deniers care about, it becomes really difficult to fully understand how these people have any reasons for their acting. At most, I think we have a very thin way of being able to take their perspective, in the sense that we seem to be able to follow the argument that they are making. That is, we can understand, if I accept those kind of premises, certain conclusions follow, but it's unclear to me how this could still be a reason for acting, because it can't be really integrated in a structure of what we as agents really care about. So there's this kind of very detached way of understanding other persons. In some sense, we would want to say, look, I understand your argument as a logical argument. I don't see why you can understand those kind of, take those premises as reasons for acting. So I don't fully understand how you cannot take the vaccine, given that vaccines seem to allow us to do so many good things. Okay, so there are levels of, different levels of empathic understanding. And even if you believe Goldhagen, at most it would give us a very thin way of understanding the other agents. We would be still very detached from making sense of them. There's also a debate about whether empathic understanding is everything that we have insofar as we make sense of agents within the social context. And I would want to say, I just want to flag that and move on, that I don't regard empathic understanding as the only form of social understanding. And we don't necessarily always engage in perspective taking in making sense of another agency. So for example, we fully understand what's going on in this kind of Zoom talk. There's a speaker, there are people who listen. I don't really have to know much about each individual's agents, why that person came to be part of the Zoom talk in order to understand what's going on. I just understand the role that each person plays in this particular context. And I want to say, sometimes we don't care to understand the people on a different level. We just understand them insofar as the social role is concerned. Yet, that doesn't mean that we couldn't give a folk psychological belief desire explanation for each and every one of us of why we participate in this kind of Zoom talk. And I would want to say this is always mediated by this kind of reenactive empathy. Moreover, and I would also want to stress that insofar as moral accountability is concerned, and insofar as we hold each other responsible for our action and hold each other accountable, we have to attribute reasons for acting to each other. And within this context, and certainly within the context of talking about perpetrators and evaluating the moral and legal culpability, we have to basically put ourselves in their perspective in order to understand their reasons for acting. Okay, and that might not be fully possible. And so therefore, there seem to be these kind of supplementary strategies. And these strategies are also necessary, I think, in order to provide further evidence for our folk psychological interpretation. Because what empathy on its own cannot do is to distinguish between two equally plausible interpretive proposals. That is, whether or not a person has certain belief and desires is a question that can only be decided in light of further evidence. And here we might have to appeal to his biography, we might have to appeal to his context, so we might have to tell more of a story of why the person did what he did, why he ended up in this particular situation. So narrative understanding, I think, has to do with trying to understand the individuality of an event or person, and how that individuality is manifested through a particularly unique developmental process. But we also might point to a form of theoretical understanding of events in their typicality. And when I'm talking about empathy as being central for understanding each other as individual agents, what I don't want to suggest is that the social sciences or the human sciences are uniquely characterized by the empathic method. What characterizes, I think, the human and social sciences uniquely is that there is this intricate interplay between these different modes of understanding: theoretical, narrative, and empathic understanding. And so what I want to do in the last 5-6 minutes of this talk is basically talk a little bit about how I understand the contribution of theoretical understanding in understanding agency in this particular context. Now, one way you can understand the contribution of theory in the social realm is by providing us with an understanding of causal processes that seem to be going on behind or in the background and are not fully conscious to the agent itself. So for example, one might want to point out that we as agents, as social creatures, tend to imitate and emulate others according to two biases: the conformity bias and the prestige bias. That is, we tend to follow the people around us, and we follow the successful one, or the ones that have social prestige. We don't have to be aware of that, but we just do that. So that explains why people tend to wear the same kind of clothes. But you also might want to think about theory here allowing us to further understand the reasons that agents might have to act in particular contexts. So you can also think about the conformity bias as providing us with a reason for acting. So think about wearing mask. And if you're ever like me, who's particularly careful, go into a shop nowadays, I might be one of the only ones wear a mask. Now people look very strangely at me, and you start understanding how that might be a reason for me not to wear a mask, because people respond to me in certain ways, and I might not want to be looked at in this particular manner. So theory here allows us to understand the reasons that people might have for acting. And in this particular context, and that's what I'm working on at the very moment, I'm actually thinking that when you look at evolutionary theory and the way we should think about human agency from that perspective, it's very clear that we as social animals are also normative animals, that insofar as we integrate into the social realm, we tend to be responsive to an intricate web of mutual interdependent individual dispositions, expectations, and normative attitudes that we have of each other. And commonly we distinguish here between conventional norms and moral norms. Most importantly, I think what characterizes us as normative animals is that some of those norms have and get a very exalted stages insofar as we regard them to be constitutive for our social identity as a member of a certain kind of group. And we feel particularly obliged to uphold those kind of norms. And we tend to react particularly emotional towards the violation of such norms. But most importantly, what I also would like to emphasize is that insofar as we are normative and moralizing animals, we don't necessarily animals in the moral sense that philosophers talk about. That is, insofar as we respect the dignity of other persons. As I like to express it, insofar as we are moralizing animals, the arc of the moral universe tends to bend towards the in-group rather than towards justice. So I think we have to strictly distinguish between us as moralizing animals and us insofar as we are committed to the moral stance. As moralizing animals, we have all kinds of norms that we take a moralizing attitudes towards. And I tend to favor Haidt here in this context and his moral foundation theory, except that I would want to suggest that I'm not so sure that we need to think about these moral foundations as cognitive modules. I think we are most promiscuous moralizers. We can take a moralizing attitude almost about anything. And so we can take a moralizing attitude even about factual claims such as the last election was stolen. And I think that's exactly what's happening at the moment. So I think we should distinguish between us as moralizing animals and us as creatures that are also in some sense committed to the moral stance from which we regard each other as having equal value, right? And that moral stance in some sense includes all of humanity. Now, I would want to suggest the moral stance is a reflective achievement. It's not an obligation that we are aware of insofar as we are social creatures. This is not a commitment that we necessarily have. And so we should not expect that harm avoidance or fairness is necessarily a moral commitment that we universally apply also to members of the outgroup. Okay, so if you think about the Milgram's experiments from this perspective, and that was something that I already talked about, or part of my question towards John yesterday, you might think about Milgram as providing us with an understanding of the causal factors that the situations assert. So it's a purely third-party perspective. Or you might also point out that it articulates or points to how the situation affects making certain features of our moralizing attitudes towards certain kind of norms, making those kind of norms salient in this particular context. And I think that's the better way of thinking about the Milgram experiments. In some sense, what the Milgram experiments that allow us to say is that in the situation in which these perpetrators found themselves, and given the background of almost 10 years of exclusion of Jews within the Nazi regime, in this very situation, even if the commanding officer of police battalion 101, Trapp, I think, allows them, it seems, to excuse themselves, they still might hold on to certain kind of commitments to loyalty. Who wants to be a traitor? Who wants to be regarded to be a coward in those kind of situations? Which might provide us with some understanding of the reasons of that kind of situation. And so it might allow us, in some sense, to understand what these people might care about in this particular situations. Now, I still would want to suggest, given the cruelty of all of that, given that these people actually were just on the way to executing their neighbors, they started realizing that they came from the same town. It just is ultimately still a bit incomprehensible of what has been going on. And this kind of particular situation, the norm of loyalty trumps the norm of harm avoidance, trumps the norm of respecting the dignity of another person. That ultimately, I want to say, is something that we still can't put our head around. And so I would want to say that ultimately, there remains this tension of different modes of understanding. And I would want to say in this particular situation, it's irreducible. We want to be able to take the perspective. And under normal circumstances, we would hope that more background information would allow us to do it. But ultimately, the situation is so horrendous that it doesn't allow us to do it. We can always say, yes, maybe that's just the way people act. But in this particular perspective, I would want to say, then we don't treat the other fully as a rational agent any longer. Now, Paul might want to say, forget about empathic understanding. We have all the understanding we need if we look at Milgram, if we look at Zimbardo. And to a certain extent, yes, there is some form of understanding, but insofar as empathic understanding is epistemically central, we can't give up on it. And personally, I also think we should not give up for practical reasons. I think we have to force ourselves into these kind of situations in order to engage in this kind of critical self-reflection, in order to really understand the horrors that we could be facing if we don't try to avoid, if we don't try to institute the social institution that Dan talked about, in order to allow us to avoid ever coming again into these kind of situations. And for me, I mean, I'm probably one of the only one in this colloquium here from a perpetrator nation. And when I actually assigned Browning's book to my seminar last time, I started realizing that part of the perpetrators from 101 Police Battalion 101 actually came from Rendsburg. That's the town 30 miles from where I grew up. So if you ask yourself, how would I have reacted in those kind of situations, it becomes kind of scary to think about that. And that's what I would like to call only fragmentary understanding. Okay, I think I went too long.
So it was very, very interesting. So very nice talk, and that you managed to link more philosophy and philosophy of social sciences. I find very valuable. So maybe there are questions, otherwise I have questions, but I won't. Other people. Stephen?
I just found this enormously interesting, I must say. You touched on so many issues in a very, I think, extremely interesting way. I want to press you on one question or set of questions. I'm not even sure I can get my question clear, but I love the fact that you made reference to Anscombe's idea of desirability characteristics and this idea that we've got to make, and you related this to Frankfurt on caring. But I want to ask about that, because when you talked about Frankfurt, Harry Frankfurt, your complaint was that he was too individualistic and didn't bring in the social. And I want to press you a bit on this, because it seems to me there's an issue here which I'd like to hear more about. You used, I noticed, I was listening very carefully to what you said, you used two different phrases when you said, when you were criticizing Frankfurt. You said, we have to realize that what we care about is socially mediated. But at another point, very shortly after that, you talked about the social constitution of human agency. Now, it seems to me those two phrases capture the question I want to ask, which is, what is it? I think, I remember hearing Anscombe talk about all this in Oxford long ago. And I remember thinking that for her, and I think this is right, these desirability characteristics, these limits where you just can't understand something. I remember the example you used to give was, how could we ever understand someone wanting a saucer of mud? And your example is the one about the leaves. But the point is that a human thing? Or is it socially constituted, the limit? That's kind of the question I want to ask. Because it seems to me, the question is this question of what we can care about something that, as at the end of your talk, you seem to say, it's pretty well unlimited. There aren't any limits. We can care about pretty well anything. I mean, it's true Jonathan Haidt gives us a list of 6, or is it 7, but still, he thinks there are limits. You seem to think there's nothing there except just the moralizing attitude, which could apply to anything, I think you think. So is that something that's kind of, in your view, a kind of socially generated thing? Or is it, as I think Anscombe thought, there's a human story here that sets the limits to what it is we can care about? So I don't know if that question helps at all, but it would help me if you'd say something about it.
Right, thanks, Stephen. That's a very, very important question. So, in the background of all of this is a little bit of Adam Smith and his a theory of moral sentiments. And so, so kind of what we care about is something that we actually think other people would, in some sense, approve of. That is, we want to be empathized with. And our caring should find some kind of applause, if you want, or at least consensus among the people that we tend to live with. So, so in some sense, and I think Smith is right when he says about, I don't really have normative attitude towards myself before other people have normative attitudes towards me. So there's always an aspect of my reasons for acting where I become doubtful about my own reasons for acting if they can't be understood by other people as reasons for acting. So I would want to say at least there has to be some group that in some sense validates my existence. And you are quite right. I didn't necessarily talk about it, that there certainly have to be some limits in terms of all humans care about life in some sense. All humans care about death, and they have certain rituals in this particular aspects. They care about their children. And so...
Not always.
Right. Okay. But I mean, yeah, but generally, right? But then what we normatively approve of and how far it goes is a question that's not always decided. That seems to be historically contingent. And how important those kind of things are, I think, is also historically contingent. I mean, Frankfurt has this very, I don't know whether you know his exchange with Susan Wolf. Very interesting debate, because Susan Wolf thinks, isn't our caring at least oriented towards real values? Doesn't it have to be oriented towards value? And he gives this very strange response where the first time I read it, I was like, my chin dropped actually. He kind of said, but at least for Hitler it was good that he cared about the genocide, at least he cared about something. He admitted that certainly it wasn't good for the rest of us, but I mean, there you see, I mean, he expresses the individualism, I mean, to an extreme that it's almost shocking. But I think actually we should take in the social aspect, and I would want to say, look, what we care about is not always very consistent. What we care about might contradict each other, and so we might have to figure it out of how it can become more consistent. So there's a certain reflective element too, and we also start reflecting about what we care about when we start realizing that what we care about, most people don't seem to care about. I mean, the problem with social media is that you always nowadays find people who seem to care about the same thing that you care about, because there are some nuts all over the place. That didn't used to be the case, right? So people who were racist at least recognize that's not a good thing to overtly and overly be racist. But nowadays, that doesn't seem, those kind of restraints seem to fall, which is a problem. Does that kind of, I mean, there are lots to be said about those.
Indeed. Thank you. Huh.
Then you have
Dan, I think, yeah.
So Karsten, I really enjoyed your presentation from beginning to end. This may be a semantic point and maybe therefore doesn't really make contact, but I think of the concept of empathy as being a fairly simple concept describing a human emotion. And I'm very taken with Martha Nussbaum's analysis of compassion as a richer concept, a concept which is a cognitive emotion, and an emotion or a state of both cognition and emotive status, which can grow, can be cultured, can be extended in a way that might have led that man who was willing to shoot the children, not to shoot the children, as he broadened his capacity for compassion. So I guess my question for you is, do you think that empathy and compassion are the same, or is there something to be gained from this more kind of cognitive approach to emotion, compassion?
Good. Well, I mean, I didn't get into the finer details of the conceptual distinctions in this realm. Now, when you look at the tradition thinking about empathy, I think there are basically two main traditions here. One is thinking about empathy insofar as it is a means of knowing other minds or relating to other minds. And then there's the tradition that in some sense goes back to David Hume and Adam Smith, where empathy is particularly important for moral judgment or developing a pro-social attitude towards each other. I would want to say insofar as Adam Smith and David Hume, I mean, in some sense, both cognitive and social moral aspects are kind of intertwined. But certainly within the empirical social psychological literature, the second tradition is the one that's emphasized. Whether or not empathy is leading to pro-social in a broad sense, pro-social behavior, pro-social judgment, etc., etc. Now, I come from the tradition in some sense that focus on empathy in the more cognitive terms, trying to understand other minds. But one nowadays distinguishes more strictly between empathy and sympathy, right? So empathy has to do with some people limited to affective states. I would also include more cognitive mental states, but the idea is I kind of reenact those states in order to understand you. So I either feel this similar as you, and then I understand what you are feeling, or I kind of simulate what you're thinking, and then I understand your reasons for acting. Now, sympathy, that is, it's a genuine emotion, the feeling of concern for another person's well-being, which leads to altruistic emotions, as Dan Batson told us. Conceptually speaking, you can feel sympathy for another person without empathizing, or you can empathize with that person without sympathy. So the sadist, right, could feel the pain of another person, but enjoy feeling the pain of the other person and just make sure that the other person feels more pain. So he has empathy without sympathy. So that's certainly possible. Now, when people talk about what's interesting, I think, in the sympathy literature, so in German, it's all called Mitleid, right? And Nietzsche and Kant even were kind of skeptical sometimes about Mitleid, which is pity, because it seems to lead to a feeling of superiority of the other person. So compassion is a feeling of sympathy without this feeling of superiority. And it seems to be a feeling of sympathy that has to do with greater misfortunes of other people, not just smaller misfortunes of other people. And so the question that I actually have, and that's something I'm actually just at the moment working on, the question is, first of all, it seems to me sympathy is as limited as empathy. There seem to be the same biases. People tend to think that we can't empathize with people that we regard to be dissimilar to us, or we are not motivated to empathize. I would want to say the same thing happens with sympathy. Now, certainly we can cultivate and to motivate us to feel empathy and to put ourselves in the perspective of the other person. But the same, I think, is true when we talk about compassion. So when Buddhists talk about compassion towards every living creature, that is certainly not necessarily a natural feeling. Rather, it's a feeling that is cultivated through certain kind of meditation techniques where we overcome our selfish biases and start recognizing the emptiness and the selflessness of each other agents. So I would want to actually argue that real compassion, and compassion that actually doesn't lead to a feeling of superiorities, has to respect the dignity of another person. And it can't actually lead to a kind of, what do you call it, patriarchal attitude towards the other person. And that means that if I want to help the person, I have to take his perspective into account. But that then seems to require something like empathy. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So thank you, Karsten. So everything you say was interesting. So I don't never dare to interrupt you because every time you say something that is so. But we don't have so much more time. So maybe we should just decide all together if we can take maybe 15 minutes after 6, so that we have the time for the discussion now, because there are 2 more questions, and I find it a pity that we don't get to listen to the questions. So John, do you have?
So I'm with you in finding Frankfurt care valuing picture appealing. And I think you're exactly right that Frankfurt went wrong in his individualism, perhaps unsurprising for a Descartes expert. But then I want to make a suggestion that I think you'll probably be less sympathetic to, but just to see how it goes. I think the most plausible way to work out the Frankfurt picture is to drop the reflectivism as well and say that people can act agentially on values they don't endorse and don't even know that they have, right? And this explains how we might act out of habit as agents, how we might act when we're self-deceived as agents. So there's some appeal there. But I was thinking it might make, that picture might make Goldhagen's story look a little bit less strange. So if one objection against Goldhagen is, look, a lot of these people were not zealots or not even Nazis, it's implausible to attribute to them eliminationist anti-Semitism. Well, Goldhagen might now say, I'm not saying they reflectively endorsed it. I'm saying it was in the water and it might be reasonably attributed to them. And so it turns out actually that they think that Jews should be slaughtered, whether they know it or not. And that's a evaluative commitment of theirs that they're responsible for. And so I'm not particularly a Goldhagen fan, but this kind of anti-reflectivist picture of how agency goes does seem to make his picture look a little less strange.
No, thanks. No, that's an important point. So when I talk about reflectiveness, it's certainly not something that I would want to say that comes in at the moment of adopting a certain kind of normative attitude. So certainly we have all kinds of normative attitudes we are not aware of. I mean, the example in the social science is always standing at a distance, right? Ethnomethodologists figured out that there are all these kind of norms that we follow, but the way to test whether or not we are committed to those norms is somehow there has to be some kind of reactive attitude that we have when people violate those kind of norms. People might look strangely at you if you don't wear a mask, or people might give you a strange look if you stand too close to people. They find it, and people are responsive to those kind of reactions. Now, if I understand Goldhagen right, he would want to, and I actually think that insofar as anti-Semitism is concerned, of the form that it is an eliminationist anti-Semitism, you at least have to have some conception of Jews are this kind of existential danger to you. Why else would you think about having to eliminate them? So there's a whole kind of, background assumptions that all of you have to basically buy into. And I think you would have to have certain kind of So going shopping and having them being professors at the universities and going to their lectures like Husserl and finding that nothing seems to be problematic about that all Germans had those kind of attitudes seems to be kind of strange from my perspective. So there has to be something that provides some evidence for the fact that those are these implicit rules that we are somehow already follow. And I think that the historical evidence is very, very thin, but yeah.
So the response to the amended Goldhagen is the non-zealous perpetrators wouldn't exhibit the reactive attitudes diagnostic of having the value.
Right. I mean, I actually would want to say what happened during the Nazi times, and I think Welser points that out very well. I think those norms seem to somehow change. I think the continuous exclusion of Jews from the public social realm changed the attitudes. I think quite dramatically in some sense, and that was allowed is something that we have to really be aware of insofar as our situation nowadays is concerned. I think that might have changed those kind of attitudes.
Nigel, question?
Thank you, Karsten. I very much enjoyed your talk and found it very thought-provoking. And with regard to the central point about the intelligibility or the understandability of such terrible actions as performed by the order police, I find myself actually sharing both that reaction, that attitude, but also the opposite. And I think it's actually the opposite that I'm, on reflection, more inclined to go with. I think actually we can find those awful actions more understandable than you suggest we can in fact do. And picking up on the previous discussion with John's question, I think actually you undersell or caricature Goldhagen's central concept of eliminationist anti-Semitism. If I interpreted or remember you rightly, you seem to take eliminationism to entail murderous action, and then if that's the case, then all those Germans for however many preceding decades or centuries would have been imbued with the same murderous mentality. But Goldhagen's concept is much more expansive and shifts and changes and modifies according to his presentation of it. So long before the Nazi era, Goldhagen attributes eliminationism as a dominant moral, political, and cultural attitude to ordinary German people, well, not non-Jewish German people, of course. But eliminationism itself, I mean, as with the concept of genocide, I mean, killing is just one way of committing genocide, okay? And likewise, with elimination, killing is one way of eliminating the so-called problem. I mean, so for example, assimilationism is another way of meeting an eliminationist goal, that you eliminate the so-called Jewish problem by Jewish people assimilating. I mean, if you look at Karl Marx's essay on the Jewish question, for instance, you see Marx there looks like both an eliminationist anti-Semite, according to Goldhagen's concept, and advocating something of a kind of assimilationist approach. Sorry, I've gone on for a bit longer than I should, but the point about, for me, how I find these awful actions perhaps more understandable than I initially wanted to is, so if you look at the current political situation in the UK, most European countries, many so-called first world countries, regarding immigration, for example, I think you find attitudes and willingness to tolerate awful treatment of wholly innocent, defenseless, vulnerable human beings that are actually quite commonplace, not merely the amongst the the political right, but many ordinary people have attitudes to immigration which maybe not at this current juncture, thankfully, license
anything like the awful murderous treatment of Jewish people in the Holocaust. But who knows how those attitudes could morph and change and develop. I mean, in the British context, quite recently, we saw a worrying policy shift whereby the UK government has now devised a scheme, made an agreement with Rwanda to deport the refugees that it receives to Rwanda. So, and of course, the government only institutes such a policy because they know that it has popular appeal. So, unfortunately, whilst on the one hand, I would like to think that the awful actions of the Order Police are not understandable, I actually think on wider reflection, they are all too understandable.
No, thanks, Nigel. That's great. But then, I mean, then it's not clear to me what's the difference between ordinary anti-Semitism and eliminationist anti-Semitism. That is, it seems to me that Goldhagen wants to say that Germans had a particular form of anti-Semitism that uniquely to the Germans. And it seems to me nobody denies anti-Semitism playing obviously an important role in bringing all of this about. But I mean, it doesn't seem to differ than saying, oh, okay, so you have anti-Semitism and then you had ways in which this anti-Semitism developed within a certain kind of social political context, but that might have developed in all other kinds of countries. So where we talk about immigration now, right? If you just think about somehow the democratic norms breaking completely down in the US, I don't know how people would react towards immigrants, but that doesn't mean that they have already always an eliminationist anti-immigration feeling. I think it's just more, you have certain kind of in-group, out-group mentality, and then if there are checks instituted or institutions that check those kind of in-group feelings and make us reflect on our own limitations. You have a way of allowing that not to fester and grow. But I mean, I don't think you need to attribute a particular form of anti-Semitism to the Germans for explanatory purposes. I mean, and so then it seems to be a relatively empty category, I would say.
Can I just, I mean, a very quick rejoinder is just on the question of the specialness, the specificity of supposedly German eliminationist anti-Semitism. Again, if I can invoke Marx's, the case of Marx, and another famous German philosopher, Wittgenstein, anybody that's seen his remarks on the so-called Jewish question, the only way they can be seen is as eliminationist also. But I'm actually not aware of, I'm sure anti-Semitism is and has historically been spread everywhere, but I think there's something distinctive to the way that the so-called Jewish problem, well, as we can see in Marx's writings and Wittgenstein's diary recordings, that suggests, you know, a particular hold on German people at that historical time.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know whether assimilation is a form of elimination, but right, I mean, that's
Goldhagen says it is.
So let's the discussion go on by mail or by papers. Could we take 5 minutes just so to breathe? So see you back in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Or I can leave it open. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk, Karsten. It was really great, really so interesting. So I just leave the video open so that you can talk if you want.